Okay, sorry. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my session on building third-party applications with Exchange APIs. My name's Glen Scales. So, David, do you do any introduction, sorry, or I'm just going to kick off, or?
Kick it right off, Glenn.
Okay, no, sorry. Let me just fire up my deck. Hang on 1 second. Okay, yeah, as I mentioned, this is my session on developing third-party applications with Exchange APIs. In this session, I'm going to be covering the challenges that ISVs and third-party application developers have when building applications that need to access Exchange mailbox data on the variety of different Exchange environments that we have in 2022. I'm going to particularly be focusing on backend applications because that's an area that I've worked in for the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And it's an area it's sort of become increasingly more complex now with the variety of different Exchange environments that we have in 2022. We have Exchange Online, we have multiple instances of Exchange Online with government and national tenants. Also with the depreciation of basic authentication, that's made applications more complex with the introduction of OAuth as well. So these are all factors that influence an ISV's ability to install an application within a new customer or service an application in an existing customer base. So I've broken this talk up into the four major challenges that an ISV or a startup would have when they're building a new application that's going to run in these variety of different Exchange environments. So first one is, what API do you use in 2022? The next is universal discovery, which is taking a minimal piece of information from the customer, maybe just the email address, and then working out which Exchange environment that mailbox is hosted in. That then flows on to authentication and which APIs you can use. And then finally, we'll talk a little about the future. We'll talk about a little bit about integration into Microsoft Teams and some of the depreciations that have happened on the AWS side. And then a little bit about loop components as well that have just started to light up in Outlook Web Access. Outlook on the web. So before I talk about which APIs you should be using in 2022, I'll just cover off some that you shouldn't be using. POP3 and IMAP, they're opposite protocols, but these things have been around for 20 or 30 years.
Hey, Glenn, I'm going to interrupt for just a second. Your deck is not showing.
Okay. Whoopsie. So you're over the top of me. How do I get my... Oh, okay. I've got to reshare, have I? Sorry. Oopsie, wrong one. Okay. Okay, there we go now.
Looks great.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, yep. So I was going through the protocols you should obviously avoid using are POP3 and IMAP. Microsoft's messaging around those that they've been legacy for quite some time. They weren't sort of designed with the security context we have in 2022 in mind. So there's they're just obviously not the best things to be using. I know a lot of ISVs do use them at the moment, but you should really have plans to move off to the graph for anything that's on Exchange Line Online or AWS for anything that's on-prem. I've included SMTP on this slide with a few asterisks around it. Obviously, there are a bunch of client scenarios that SMTP is still going to be valid in, but just for general purpose, sending of email in 2022, you're better off steering towards the graph and AWS to do that. SMTP is no longer the simplest thing to implement, especially with OAuth as well. And the library support for AWS and graphs is pretty good these days. So next slide, this sort of lists out most of the Exchange APIs that have been around since Exchange 4. I just wanted to highlight the fact that Exchange APIs get depreciated and have been depreciated over the years. So it's something that if you're building third-party applications with Exchange, you should always have in the back of your mind, especially with some of the talk around AWS. The ones that are still valid today, I've kept in bold. Obviously, MAPI or Exchange ROPS, which is the underlying protocol for that, still used in the Windows desktop client. HX is used, Microsoft Sync protocol is used in Outlook Mobile. That protocol isn't really available to ISVs and application developers. It's something that Microsoft's keeping as a private protocol at the moment. Exchange Web Services, been around since Exchange 2007. It's probably the workhorse for most modern applications these days because of its kind of simplicity and its use within sort of most environments. Graph API is the newest one. Can only be used against Exchange Online. There was a hybrid preview version that worked in hybrid environments against the Exchange REST endpoints. That's now been depreciated and will stop working in March next year. And Graph Data Connect, which is the latest API that you can use to connect to mailbox data. I'm not going to cover it too much because it tends to be a little bit out of reach of ISVs and startups. It has a paywall in front of it. It's a pretty good sort of API or concept. It allows you sort of tenant level access to your mailbox data. But as I said, it tends to be sort of more towards the enterprise developer who can pay and then sort of deal with all the sort of Azure hosting requirements. So it's very hard to build a turnkey solution around that API. But it's a good one to check out. So Exchange admin APIs, these are really relevant to ISVs when you want to do things outside of accessing mailbox data. So you're looking at more sort of server management, message tracking, maybe permissions management. The ones that are still relevant today, obviously on-prem, remote PowerShell and the EMS. If you're doing anything online, it's the XOV2. Just a quick tip there, if you are doing anything sort of online-ish, steer towards the new REST commandlets that have been developed and deployed. If you ever tried to scale remote PowerShell on Exchange Line in really large clients, you'll find that it doesn't scale very well. That's why they developed those REST commandlets. So take advantage of those and your code will be a lot better. So platforms really determine which APIs we can use. So in 2022, we have three major platform types. We've got Exchange Online and those multiple instances I mentioned, government and national tenants. You've got hybrid environments where your mailboxes may be on-prem or in the cloud, or you've got your classic Exchange environments. In all those environments, you can use EWS and MAPI. In online, you can use the graph. And at the moment, as I said, with the depreciation of the hybrid graph, you can't sort of use those old REST endpoints anymore, or they don't recommend that you use those REST endpoints anymore. So all these APIs have limitations, and that makes it challenging for any sort of ISVs or startups to develop just on one API. As I said, I get that first list of all those Exchange APIs I have. There's a lot of them around, and Outlook has always used more than one API by default to do what it needs to do. So limitations of MAPI or Exchange ROPS, they tend to be pretty hard to build. Exchange ROPS is a pretty complicated protocol. It's documented very well online. If you ever do want to build a raw sort of MAPI application, what most people do is they use Outlook as the MAPI provider and then use a third-party library over the top of that, like Redemption's a good example. I've built those applications. They do work pretty well in production. However, they tend to be a little bit fragile. When new versions of Outlook come out, those applications tend to break. They can be a little bit hard to support in different environments when you compare them against AWS or Graph. So it doesn't give you full coverage. Since Exchange 2007, things like FreeBusy and meeting suggestions have been moved towards Exchange Web Services, and that sort of continued on into the graph in later versions, and lack of open library support. So if you wanted to build like a Node.js app that used MAPI, you won't find any libraries that actually support it, so you're really stuck on Windows. Limitations of EWS, obviously around the depreciations that have happened in basic authentication. A lot of the messaging has been around EWS being a legacy API, so that's now affected the customers' sort of, I guess, expectations or what they'll want from a new app. And say a new application that's coming into their tenant, especially if they're Exchange Online. If you tell them that you're using EWS, they may come back and say, well, that's a legacy API, and that affects you possibly selling into that customer if you're an ISV. Most of the legacy messaging has been around the security model being too open. With EWS, you only have the full mailbox access sort of security model. So if you're building an application that only needs to access calendar data, you can't sort of lock it down to just being able to access the calendar data like you can with the graph model. New features like creating Teams meetings not included. Obviously, AWS was built before Teams sort of came onto the scene. So, if you want to create a meeting and make it a Teams meeting in the graph, it's really simple. You set one property when you're creating the meeting. In AWS, there's nothing really to help you out. You'll have to use another graph API to create the meeting and get all the links and then paste that information back into the AWS meeting. So it's a little bit convoluted in that perspective. Third-party library support. AWS has pretty good third-party library support. However, a lot of those third-party libraries are now not being maintained because the people that originally created them have moved on. So most of them do support OAuth, but the actual usability of those libraries vary, so they may not support things like token refresh. A lot of those libraries are no longer being updated, so they may have dependencies that become security issues in the future. So you may find you need to maintain those libraries yourself or contribute back to them. Future inability to create application registration. So Microsoft announced early this year that they were going to stop people creating applications that had AWS permissions in the Azure portal. They've backtracked on that and said they're going to put that on hold based on the feedback that they got. But it's a depreciation risk in the future. If that comes into effect, then you may find issues installing applications into new clients. So if you just went down to developing on the AWS front, you may sort of find your application no longer viable in new customers. So limitations of the Microsoft Graph, there's a few of these as well. It doesn't work on prem mailboxes, so you can't sort of build an application that's going to work in hybrid or classic Exchange environments. You can't use it to access archive mailboxes and public folders. Hopefully at this stage, you're not building any public folder applications. But for a lot of customers, archive mailboxes are definitely in scope. It doesn't give you full coverage of data access that's available in AWS. So if you're building particular applications, migration, sort of compliance or data analytics type applications, you really do need to be able to access all items in a mailbox, and the graph sort of limits your ability. Things like you can't enumerate all the folders in a mailbox. You have very limited access to the dumpster. So an example of that is if you're building a contact application and you want to access the deleted contacts that have gone into the dumpster. With the graph, you can't get access to those. You can get access to the mail items in the dumpster because the contacts have a item class of IPM contact. The graph doesn't allow you to access those types of items, and that can be a real pain in some applications. Throttling limits are way too restrictive in the graph. As a comparison, AWS, you can have 27 concurrent connections. In the graph, that's limited down to 4. Batch sizes are a huge issue if you're building applications that need to access a lot of items at once, which tends to be typical with a mailbox application. Within the graph, the throttling limits are you can have 20 items in a batch that execute synchronously, or you can have 4 that execute concurrently. So I've had issues myself around building applications that do message hygiene. We had to move a lot of messages. You just couldn't build an application with a graph that sort of worked in a timely function when you're scaling across a client where you have thousands of mailboxes. It just sort of becomes a real problem. Missing functionality or functionality in beta. A lot of the active development on the mail endpoints in the graph has sort of slowed down a fair bit over the last few years. So there are things like reference attachments or cloudy attachments. It's been sitting in beta since 2017 in the graph for whatever reason. Probably one of the frustrations for ISVs is not having an API that you can use to modify or access the new signature, roaming signature features in the graph. In Office 365. There is a 4 megabyte request limit, so this affects things like sending messages as MIME. So that was one of the new features that was added recently in the graphs. Messages as MIME, so that means you can build a message that you're sending in an external library such as MailKit or MIMEKit and send that using the graph. But because of the 4 megabyte request limit, once you want to send larger messages, you start to run into problems there. And then so at that stage, you'll have to go back to using something like AWS to work around that problem. So what API should I be using in 2022? My recommendation is that you use a hybrid of AWS and Graph. Obviously, with Exchange Online, you want to do everything you can possibly do with Graph up until you hit sort of the restrictions in the API, and then sort of switch to using EWS. With on-prem and hybrid on-prem mailboxes, you need to use EWS to access those mailboxes because there isn't really any other options at the moment. Directory access hasn't really changed much. So if you're doing a lot of address lists, that distribution list type stuff, EWS has always had some limited functionality there. LDAP tended to be a better option if you're using it on-prem, but Microsoft Graph is still the way to go in Exchange Online. Management and reporting, a lot of ISVs do this stuff. So Microsoft Graph has a bunch of reporting endpoints that are quite good for doing things like mailbox size and mailbox activity. So they're definitely the way to go. On-prem, you're still going to be using the remote PowerShell to get access to the commandlets that get all that information. If you are doing any message tracking in Exchange Online, the Office 365 reporting web service is still the one to use. That only supported basic authentication, but I think there is a roadmap item to include OAuth support into that. So if you are using that service at the moment, or you're going to plan to use it in the future, you should be planning to switch to OAuth with that web service. I don't know what their future plans are around that one. But the major differences between EWS and Graph is important. Obviously, Graph is a JSON-based service, while EWS is using SOAP or XML. Obviously, the development experience on JSONs tends to be a lot better around library support and just kind of working with it in general. Security model Graphs obviously has a much more superior security model because it allows you to limit access. Applications just have or need to one endpoint. So if you're building a contact application, you can sort of limit its access to the contacts. Access to all items in a mailbox here. This is obviously for some applications, you need access to all items and all folders, potentially configuration items. So the Graph doesn't allow you to do that, and that's when you're probably going to need to use EWS. Notification model Graph has a much more modern approach to notifications using webhooks. Tends to be a better development experience. EWS was built sort of pre-cloud, so the push-pull notifications, the way they work, holding the actual notification stuff on the CAS server can be a little bit fragile in the cloud. Tends to work okay on-prem where you've got a very stable environment. Streaming notifications were the last thing that was sort of developed around EWS. They still work pretty good in the client context, and the Graph doesn't really have an alternative to streaming notifications. So streaming notifications are good, sort of good because you don't need to have a public-facing IP address to basically be receiving the notifications from the cloud or from Exchange. Where Graph, obviously with webhooks, you'll need to have some sort of public endpoint that's going to be receiving those notifications. Not that hard these days with Azure and sort of hosting, but it's one thing to consider if you're building client applications. Throttling, as I mentioned, AWS has a much more ISV-friendly throttling arrangements than the Graph. But let's kick on to universal discovery. So universal discovery is basically taking a minimal piece of information from the customer and working out which Exchange environment that mailbox is hosted on. Particularly important now, as I've talked about, you may be using multiple APIs in your application. You certainly may be using multiple authentication methods if in hybrid or obviously classic on-prem environments as well. So in EWS, you want to work out, the Exchange environment, what authentication I want to use, and what the EWS endpoint is. In the Graph, you sort of want to know, is this a global or a national tenant? You actually want to know that in EWS as well, because that changes which endpoint you use. If you are going to be using user-based authentication, you may want to know a little bit more about the federation that's active in that tenant. Hopefully, you're going to be using the Microsoft authentication libraries that sort of help in the sort of federation sense, but that can get quite complicated when you are authenticating in different federation environments. So my tip is generally start your universal discovery process with the OpenID configuration document. This is part of the OAuth 2 standard. So I've just got an example there of the Azure endpoint to get the OpenID configuration document. And what that will return, well, that will tell you, is the person, or is this domain? Firstly, does Azure know anything about it? And if you get a response, that doesn't actually mean that they're an Azure tenant. It just means that there's some configuration information about that domain. but it'll actually tell you whether a particular host is a national or a government tenant. So I've got a quick sample of that. This is just a quick C# method that I created. It just basically grabs the OpenID configuration document for a particular domain, looks at the MS graph host claim that comes back as part of that response, and then it sort of, if I then use it next screen in a unit test, I can sort of work out, is this a national tenant? If I get the national tenant endpoint back, in the next example, I'm just using a Chinese domain, and I just check to see, well, if is this the Chinese tenant? I've just used fake domains here, but if you actually wanted to run it in production, if you used Microsoft.com, you would get the global endpoint. If you used Via21, who run the Microsoft tenants in China, you would get the Chinese endpoint back. See if you use one of the, if you knew a government tenant that was hosted in one of the government tenants in the US, you could do the same thing with your test. So auto discover has been the traditional method of doing sort of universal discovery. Started in Exchange 2007, was really successful up until sort of the mass adoption of kind of Exchange Online. So to cater for the issues around hybrid environments, they introduced AutoDiscover v2, which was a JSON-based service with no authentication. It just sort of returns the endpoints you can actually use. So you may use AutoDiscover v2 to discover the AutoDiscover v1 endpoint, and then use AutoDiscover v1, or Outlook would use it to get all the configuration information it needs to create the MAPI binding. AutoDetect, that's used by Outlook Mobile, just included that sort of out of interest. If you're building a universal discovery mechanism, just that first link there has a really good sort of step-by-step method that Outlook Mobile uses to do this sort of process of detecting where a mailbox is hosted. It's sort of a good one to look at. And CSS to build a script that sort of shows you how to go through that as well in PowerShell. It's quite good. So yeah, so with the universal discovery method, if you if you detect that someone is using hybrid environment, you sort of want to check, do they have hybrid modern authentication enabled, so that in a hybrid environment, it may or may not be enabled depending on how the customer's configured it. So to help you out there, first use AutoDiscover v2 to work out, is it actually a hybrid environment? Is that mailbox hosted online, or is it hosted on-prem? When you make that v2 request, you basically send it to Office 365 first. If it's there, it will return back the Office 365 endpoint. If it's not there, or it's on-prem, it will return a redirection to the sort of local on-prem Exchange server. If you then use that endpoint, it'll the part of the protocol, you check on-prem. If it's on-prem, it'll then return back the correct endpoint. You can then use that endpoint to check whether hybrid modern authentication is enabled by sending what's called a blank bearer request. So I have an example of that on my next screen. So this is just basically a simple HTTP GET with a blank authorization bearer header. What you get back as a response to that is a 401, kind of like challenge response you get in integrated or NTLM authentication. You can then check the www authenticate headers. In this example, you can see I've got a bearer response, and the authorization URI points me back to Azure. So I know in this case that hybrid modern authentication is enabled on this server. I can also tell that integrated authentication is also enabled on the server, so that could be an option in this instance. But obviously, if hybrid modern authentication is there, you should definitely use it to make sure your application is as secure as it can be. So I've just got a simple C# sample here as well of doing that. In my sample, I'm actually using the trusted issuer. The trusted issuer that comes back in that response contains the Office 365 Exchange GUID, sort of appended to your tenant ID. So it's either or you could sort of use in that context. All this code I'm actually going to release later on my GitHub. So if you're interested in any of that sort of code I'm showing in this deck. So yeah, my recommended discovery path is look at the OpenID configuration document first using the domain name you obviously grab from the customer, then you can work out from that whether it's a national or a government tenant. If it is, You need to use the static sort of endpoints that Microsoft publish to then do your auto discover v2 check to see, is this mailbox then hosted online or is it on-prem? If you get back an on-prem response, do your blank bearer request, check if it's hybrid modern authentication enabled, and then sort of start your authentication process there. If it's obviously online, then you could probably go down to the process of using the graph, or depending if you're using AWS. If everything fails, or if the OpenID configuration document doesn't contain anything, you probably know that it's a classic Exchange environment, so that's where you would basically use Autodiscover v1. But if those other two steps fail, Autodiscover v1 is always your fallback method. And then if everything fails, just ask for a manual config, just so your application can still work. There's probably the 1 or 2% of customer environments that have sort of configurations where nothing will work, and that's just kind of the way it is. So these are all the authentication methods that are available on Exchange. I think I've covered most of them today. Obviously, with classic environments, I think they are talking about adding a modern authentication method in the future. So it's probably going to be an addition to this list. Certificate-based authentication it's been available on-prem for quite some time. I think that's coming online over the last few months as well. So that's potentially an option for you in the future. I can't do too much, but generally with backend applications, when you're doing authentication, you're running in an unattended scenario, so you don't have obviously user input to do the authentication. The best method for ISVs to use is the client credentials flow, which basically means you don't have any user authentication. You just have a SSL certificate or a client secret, but you shouldn't be using client secrets in production. If you are using the client credential flow, always make sure that you use application policy. So by default, the client credentials flow gives you full access to all mailboxes in a tenant. So application policies allow you to lock that down to just the mailboxes that you need to access. The other method you can use for unattended scenarios is the resource owner password credentials flow, which is basically where you have a traditional set of user credentials. And it's just, I guess, a simplified OAuth request to grab the access token using the username and password as part of the request. ROPC can be a real pain in federated environments, which most large customers use these days or have been using. I've included a link on this page that goes through enabling direct ROPC authentication to bypass those federation issues. Unfortunately for ISVs, this means forcing a configuration on your customers who may or may not like that. So ROPC is generally one to avoid if you can, because it means you have to handle the credentials for the customer as well, username and password, which tends to be less secure and less favorable. So authentication tips. Always try and use the Microsoft authentication libraries. They'll give you the best development experience. They handle things like token caching. They do the token refresh for you. They handle all the challenges in the actual underlying protocol for you. So they make life a lot easier. I've seen people roll their own authentication code, and I've done it as well. Tends not to work very well, sort of in a serviceability sort of perspective. If you're using the client credential flow, as I mentioned, make sure you use application policies to lock down the scope that your authentication has to the mailboxes in a tenant. Always use certificates instead of client secrets. Yeah, especially if you're using hybrid modern authentication. If you try to use client secrets, you'll find that the access tokens generated don't have a high enough level of trust. Make your MSAL code instance aware. So I talked about that in Universal Discovery. It's not very well documented in a lot of the authentication stuff. So instance aware just means that it can sort of recognize that it's a national or government tenant, and it will sort of still work as expected. I've just included a link in this deck. Beware of token expiration and include renewal. That's pretty important, especially when you're using some of these third-party libraries. They don't sort of have any links or callbacks to handle token expiration. A good example of that is if you're using the AWS Managed API, which is Microsoft's AWS library. The current GitHub version of that doesn't include any callbacks to do token expiration or token renewal. In my GitHub, I've included a few sort of modifications and methods you could do to include that in that library. So that's certainly something to be aware of and to take care with. Include the full response in the debug messages. So authentication will give you can have a lot of issues with authentication, especially when you go down the ROPC route, especially things like conditional access policies. So having the full debug message or the full sort of response you get from any sort of authentication issues can help you troubleshoot. Another point on that is using the Azure sign-in logs to diagnose problems. That's really going to help you, especially when, as you said, you've got things like conditional access policies being applied that can sort of tell you what's actually going on, why you're actually getting the errors that you're getting. Common sense stuff is that you never distribute your app certificates if you're using the client credentials flow within your application. If you're building a traditional application where you're shipping DLLs to a customer, because they can obviously reverse engineer that and get access to your certificate. And expect the authentication part of your code to change in the future, and try to host that if you can, because that allows you to keep it as up-to-date as possible for your customers. Obviously, as I mentioned, they're looking at modern authentication in Exchange on-prem. That's on their roadmap. But even in the cloud, things like continuous access evaluation, authentication is always changing, and it sort of needs to be a really active part of your testing. If you have an existing application out there, or you're looking to build a new application in the future, it's something you're going to need to actively manage as a developer or as an ISV. So development and testing environments, this is probably more towards someone new writing an application, or a startup looking to build an application to deploy. Obviously, you're going to have to service that and sort of keep it obviously in sort of a test framework. So as a minimum, you want an Office 365 tenant. You want to make sure that it's federated. You can use ADFS, obviously it's for free. There's a bunch of third-party federation providers like Okta and Ping Federate, etc. out there that you could also use. You want to make sure you have some on-prem environments that are configured as hybrid. You want to make sure you've got hybrid modern authentication set up in a few of those environments so you can test how your application is going to work. And then you want to have some dedicated Exchange 2016 and 2019 environments just to basically check that your application still works when things like CUs or new CUs are deployed and put into that environment. So yeah, it's testing can be, I guess having those testing environments can be sort of a big impost on ISVs and application developers. So just basically going into the future, integration extensibility. So learn how to use extended properties in AWS. This is more aimed towards newer people that are developing on Exchange. So with an Exchange item, it's sort of the way it's represented in the Exchange store is as a bunch of MAPI properties. You could think of it as a JSON document. Those MAPI properties are then represented in the APIs like AWS Graph as strongly typed properties. But with AWS and Graph, you can always get access to those underlying properties, especially for new things. I guess the roaming signatures are probably a good example. There's no APIs or methods you can use to get access to that sort of information via the sort of conventional methods, but you could use extended properties to access things like signature information until the APIs sort of catch up. So with Teams integration, Microsoft recently announced that they were going to restrict access to the Teams compliance data that has always been stored within a mailbox via AWS. It was supposed to start in October, but they've pushed it back another 3 months to January 31st. This can be an issue for a lot of applications, especially existing applications that have used those compliance records. You're going to need to start now using the Teams APIs. And some of those APIs have paywalls in front of them, like the export API, so that may impact on your margins if you're an ISV. So it's something to be aware of. If you are looking to do any integration from Exchange to Teams, always use those Teams APIs now instead of trying to get access via AWS. Loop components are probably a more important one, and they affect back-end applications going forward. So typically with an Exchange item, everything was stored in the Exchange store. So when an application needed to do a compliance operation, they could just access the item, access the body, access the attachments. Obviously, with reference attachment or cloudy attachments, that's sort of changed a little bit. The attachments now get stored in the attachment provider, whether it be OneDrive or something else. With loop components, that's going to change again. So you're now going to have loop components that exist in the body of the message, but the data within those components are obviously now sort of distributed, and you'll need to use things like the Azure Fluid Relays to get access to that actual data. I think from a compliance perspective, it tends to be a little bit of an afterthought for Microsoft. So how they handle things like making sure that the information that's contained within those loop containers doesn't validate any of the compliance issues that you may have built applications around can be an issue. It's probably more an opportunity for ISVs, but there's obviously loop components still at pretty much the early adopter stage. But I guess my point is, if you have an application that's out there now that is doing some sort of compliance operations based on the body of the message, that's going to affect your application going forward, because you're no longer going to find all the content that's particularly within a body of the message now within the Exchange source. So it's going to be within another location, which tends to be a problem. Let's say community call to action. Okay, obviously this is a community conference, so I have a few call to actions. If you are using any of the third-party, especially the AWS third-party libraries out there, you'll see a lot of them are now marked as we're no longer updating them. Obviously, the people that probably created them have moved on to bigger and better things. But obviously, as application developers, we really need to help out and support the people that created them and the actual libraries themselves. So keeping the dependencies up to date, improving the OWL support in particular. Give feedback and upvote features in the graph. I said the graph features are sort of in a bit of a limbo at the moment, so it's not moving a lot. So help upvoting particular features to get them into the graph will help a lot. So I've included a link to the feedback portal. And helping with documentation and sample code. A lot of that stuff's now on GitHub, so it's quite easy to contribute to. So I would recommend that if you can help out on the documentation and sample code side, that you try and do so. And I've smashed through my content, so I'm up to the Q&A stage. So I guess I'll open it up to questions. I'll just go back and check the chat quickly. If you do have any questions, you can either raise your hand and we can have a chat, or stick questions in the chat. Give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm just looking. Oh, sorry. Okay, just looking at one question here at the moment. Is there a roadmap for the Graph API telling you when and if we'll be able to set retention labels on mail folders? Probably say that's always been in EWS. There's actually a strongly typed property that allowed you to do that. I guess are you talking about the older stuff? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that would work. You can do it. You've always been able to do it via extended properties. So I think that would work.
Yeah, I can do it with EWS currently on Exchange on-prem, but I cannot do it for Exchange Online using Graph API.
Have you tried using the extended properties? That's always worked in EWS.
No, and that is something that I was added after seeing your slide about it. So I will read about it, and hopefully it will work.
Yeah, I've done it before with the graph, and it does. Yeah, it still works the same way. It's the same extended properties. I think EWS actually had a nice sort of strongly typed one that you could set. That's not available in the graph. It probably should be, but it's not. But yeah, that should definitely work. Let me scroll a bit.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions?
How about working with Archive Mailbox? Do we have some ATA for this?
All I've heard is they're looking at it. I haven't seen a roadmap item, so I don't. I don't know what they've got to it. I don't know what there's obviously the archive folder in the mailbox, which is really confusing. What their plans are with archives as they go forward. I think there should. it really should be done. Like we do really need access from the graph for archive mailboxes, but I haven't seen any sort of roadmap items to do it at the moment.
Sure, thanks.
No worries. Thank you. Anyone else? Otherwise, I'll give you your day back. I think there's some ending side. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I've just included my Twitter handle there, GitHub, which is where I'll post the code for this slide. Sorry, not for this deck. But if no one else has got any other questions, thank you everyone for attending. Hope you've had a great MEC. I think there's another day tomorrow, which is going to be pretty good. I just got up in the morning, so I've got to go back and watch all the videos that were on today. But thank you for attending my session. Thank you.
Thank you.